As my audience knows, I have continued to document the carnage of the progressive left's toxic and myopic assault on American values, history, corporate culture, criminal justice, academia, climate change, and the indoctrination therein. I'm sure, or at least I hope, you were as sickened as me watching tens of thousands zombie-like student protesters from the Ivy League all the way to Stanford, Oregon, and Cal Berkeley, applauding Hamas terrorists for the murder and beheading of Israeli women and children. What I saw can be likened to most episodes of the AMC's The Walking Dead. It should be noted that there are still many college students that are honest, moral, and decent young Americans who love their country and value their privilege of a higher education. No, I speak of a loud, ignorant, dumb, vocal group of miscreants known as Generation Z. It is amazing to me that these students liken their current misconduct to the college protests on campuses back in the 1960s. That's a bunch of crap. While civil rights, gender equality, and environmental concerns were part of the protests of the 60s, they were collateral and incidental. The galvanizing gravamen of the 60s protests was the fact that many of the protesters' college friends were being sent off to slaughter in an unjust war in Vietnam. What we are seeing today is something different, specifically the cancer spewing out of the indoctrination going on at college campuses. The images of student protesters chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," has been seared into our collective conscience. Let me be clear that it is not an extremist minority. According to the latest Harvard-Harris poll, a majority of Generation Z students believes the Hamas killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians in Israel can be justified by the grievances of oppressed Palestinians. In other words, a majority of Generation Z students believe the raping, murdering, beheading, and kidnapping of Jewish civilians is just fine. Why is this? There is a good answer in an editorial by the Washington Examiner's editorial writers. I will now quote from that editorial. The sources of Generation Z's sickness are twofold. First, the education system has immersed them in a Manichaean, oppressed and oppressor worldview. Women are oppressed and therefore good. Men are oppressors and therefore bad. Black people are oppressed and therefore good. White people are oppressors and therefore bad. Palestinians are oppressed and therefore good. Jews are oppressors and therefore bad. The key to this view is that identity reigns supreme, not actions. Black youth stealing cars is acceptable because the perpetrators are oppressed. White police arresting them for committing crimes is bad because police are oppressors. Generation Z saying Hamas murdering Jews is justified. The oppressed and oppressor worldview has bred a culture of victimhood. Since possession of an oppressed identity is the only path to moral salvation, Generation Z has become obsessed with finding a way to be considered themselves oppressed. Witness Zoomers suddenly deciding they are gay, lesbian, or transgender. The second source of Gen Z's sickness is a social media addiction that reinforces victimhood far beyond the classroom. Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok are full of content promoting the oppressed and oppressor narrative. In addition to turning Zoomers into a generation of anti-American terrorist sympathizers, victimhood culture and social media have made Gen Z the most depressed and suicidal ever. The proportion of young women reporting clinical depression within the last year has gone from 11% in 2011 to almost a third today. Twice as many teenagers are taking their lives today as there were 15 years ago. End quote. Well, folks, this is very scary news. One can only hope that what happened to the 60s counterculture baby boomers happens to Generation Z. You remember that what seemed like a good idea at 18 or 19 back in the 60s, going organic, living in nature, communes, free love and drugs, didn't play so well 10 years on. You know, Children need a roof over their heads, not a tent. Good clothes, schooling. After several years, hitchhiking got old and cars were needed. Living off the land for food also got old. However, shelter, warmth, food, and gas for your car costs money, which means you need a job. I've often said in these views that the only thing that happens new in the world is the history you don't know. That was Harry Truman. It's already happening. Top Fortune 500 companies are demanding video evidence from the Ivy League schools for identification purposes so that these student protesters never get a job on Wall Street. Without endowments from Jewish Americans, the protesters wouldn't have dormitories or lecture halls to get indoctrinated in. It's one thing to change the world when you're having a good time at college, usually on someone else's dime, like parents. However, thankfully for our future in this country, reality awaits.